He was the governor who fought for justice, signing laws to protect the very officers who now shoved him into a squad car, mocking his humanity. A neighborhood walk turned into a public spectacle of humiliation as two policemen, blinded by prejudice, failed to recognize the man who held their futures in his hands. The crowd's whispers of disbelief swelled into a roar as the truth unraveled, exposing the fragility of power in the face of systemic bias. What Jerome Wilkes did next would shock even those who had seen it all. But let's go back to the beginning. Governor Jerome Wilkes, a charismatic leader in his mid-40s, was known for his calm demeanor and tireless advocacy for social justice. Despite holding one of the highest offices in the state, Jerome never distanced himself from the people he served. His love for the city where he was born and raised was evident in every policy he championed, from affordable housing to educational reform. Yet, that evening, he sought solitude, a moment to ground himself amidst the whirlwind of political responsibilities. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie, dark jeans, and well-worn sneakers, Jerome exuded a modest, approachable presence. His attire, though unassuming, symbolized his deep connection to the working-class neighborhood where his roots ran deep. As he strolled past graffiti-covered brick walls and dimly lit storefronts, Jerome reflected on the weighty decisions of the day, including the signing of a pivotal bill aimed at increasing police accountability and funding for officer training. The hum of an approaching police cruiser disrupted his thoughts, the sharp blare of a siren breaking the quiet. Red and blue lights bathed the street as two officers stepped out of the car, their postures radiating authority. The taller officer, Riggs, spoke first, his tone abrasive. "Hey, you! Hands where I can see 'em." Jerome instinctively raised his hands, confusion clouding his calm expression. "Is there a problem, officers?" Jerome asked, his voice steady, but tinged with disbelief. Riggs smirked, towering over him. "We got reports of someone matching your description, acting suspiciously. What are you doing out here this late?" Jerome's response was measured, even as his mind raced. "I'm just walking home. I grew up around here." The younger officer interjected, his eagerness to assert authority evident. "Yeah? And I grew up in Beverly Hills. Hands on the car now." Jerome complied without protest, his eyes scanning the growing crowd of onlookers. As Officer Riggs patted him down with unnecessary force, murmurs rippled through the group. Some bystanders recognized him, their whispers growing urgent. "Isn't that Governor Wilkes?" someone asked aloud, the question prompting several to pull out their phones. Jerome stood still, his silence a deliberate choice. He knew the unfolding scene spoke louder than words ever could. Jerome Wilkes, still calm despite the humiliating ordeal, was handcuffed and led toward the squad car. The cold metal cuffs bit into his wrists, a sharp contrast to his composed demeanor. Officer Riggs, his chest puffed with authority, couldn't resist cracking a joke. "Can you believe this guy? Just another one of those innocent guys taking a walk," Riggs mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. His partner, Officer Quinn, a younger officer eager to follow Riggs' lead, laughed, adding, "Bet he'll be crying for his mommy soon, or his lawyer." Their voices carried over the murmurs of the crowd, which had now swelled significantly. People whispered and pointed, their voices growing louder with recognition. "Isn't that Governor Wilkes?" A middle-aged woman near the front asked, her voice cutting through the din. The question rippled through the onlookers, fueling the wave of disbelief and anger. Jerome was unceremoniously placed in the back of the squad car. He kept his eyes on the officers, observing every word, every action. His gaze was steady, unflinching, a silent reminder that he was not the helpless victim they imagined. The officers, too preoccupied with their mockery, didn't notice the crowd's reaction or Jerome's penetrating stare. Riggs pointed to Jerome's shoes as he leaned against the car, smirking. "Guess the budget cuts didn't hurt his sneakers," he jeered, nudging Quinn for validation. Quinn chuckled, clearly enjoying the banter. Inside the car, Jerome's phone buzzed in his pocket, an incessant vibration that neither officer cared to investigate. Across town, Jerome's staff was already in a frenzy. His location tracker, typically used for security purposes, flagged his abrupt stop. Calls to his phone went unanswered, heightening their concern. Meanwhile, the crowd outside grew louder, their outrage palpable. Smartphones recorded every moment, capturing Riggs's arrogance and Jerome's composed silence. The officers, oblivious to the brewing storm, treated the incident as just another routine stop, completely unaware that the man in their custody was not just another suspicious figure, but the governor himself, and that the consequences of their actions were far beyond anything they could imagine. As the squad car began to pull away, the sound of another set of sirens pierced the air. A second police cruiser came to an abrupt stop beside the growing crowd. Out stepped Captain Monroe, his crisp uniform and commanding presence instantly drawing attention. But it wasn't his usual air of authority that captured the crowd's focus. It was the look of pure shock that crossed his face as his eyes locked on the man in the back seat of the squad car. "Governor Wilkes?" Monroe's voice cracked, disbelief and alarm flooding his tone. His pale complexion betrayed his growing panic. The crowd fell silent for a brief moment, their phones still trained on the scene, capturing every second. Riggs frowned, his arms crossed. "Governor who?" he muttered, glancing at his partner, who looked equally confused. Monroe wasted no time. He strode to the back of the squad car, his movements brisk but heavy with urgency. Pulling open the door, he stared at Jerome with a mix of mortification and apology. "Governor Wilkes, are you okay? What happened?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Jerome stepped out of the car with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout the ordeal. His tall frame and poised demeanor immediately silenced any lingering doubts among the crowd. Turning slowly, he fixed his sharp gaze on Riggs and his partner. "It seems these officers thought I matched a description," Jerome said, his tone measured but undeniably pointed. "Care to explain, Officer Riggs?" The color drained from Riggs' face as the realization hit him. His once cocky posture wilted, replaced by a rigid stance of panic. His partner, Quinn, shifted uneasily, his eyes darting from the crowd to Monroe and back to Jerome. The weight of their mistake pressed down on them like a suffocating fog. The silence shattered as the crowd erupted into a cacophony of anger and disbelief. "They didn't even know who he was," one voice shouted. "This is what we've been talking about," another cried. The officers, now the targets of public scorn, stood frozen, their earlier bravado crumbling under the glare of accountability. Monroe turned to Riggs, his jaw clenched. "We'll discuss this later," he said sharply, before turning back to Jerome with a quiet, "I'm so sorry, sir." But the damage was done, and the world was watching. The viral videos spread within minutes, capturing the blatant profiling and mockery. By the time Jerome returned to the governor's mansion, the incident had exploded online, drawing both local and national attention. The next morning, Jerome held a press conference. Standing at the podium, he addressed the state. "Last night, I experienced firsthand what so many of our citizens face every day, being judged and mistreated based on appearance alone. This is why we must continue to reform not only our police training, but the culture within law enforcement." The officers were placed on administrative leave, pending investigation, and Jerome's experience became a rallying cry for accountability. Behind closed doors, Riggs faced his commanding officer, the grim reality of his actions, now fully exposed. For Jerome, the incident was a turning point, not only for his administration, but for a community tired of systemic injustice. The same officers who had mocked him unknowingly became the faces of why reform was needed. And Jerome? He continued his fight, now with a renewed personal conviction, to ensure no one else would endure what he had.